Ladies and gentlemen, can you hear me? Okay. How about now? My name is Scott Walker. I'm the editor of the Rocky Mountain Fur Trade Journal. And every year we have talks that have to do with the articles that we published this year. I'm going to make a very quick introduction to Jim Hardee and his articles so that we can keep within our time slot. Jim is a historian, writer, longtime editor of the Rocky Mountain Fur Trade Journal. And even to this day, when I paint myself into a corner and need some advice on how to make an editorial decision, I will email Jim, and usually the tagline is "Help me, Obi-Wan." So Jim has written an article about the Sublette Trace, which is a perfect example of how fur traders' trails became the later immigrant trails. And it also starts to put together what we read in the secondary source histories and match it to the ground that these people traveled over. So with no further ado, I'll turn it over to Jim.
Thanks, Scott. Thank you all for being here. Glad to see you made it. Got your way through all that traffic, all those folks coming from the city out here to the wonderful country. I happened to be in the square there in Jackson a few days ago, and I was listening to this big Texas farmer, this rich guy, gentleman farmer, talking with this poor Oklahoma dirt farmer. The Texas guy was describing how big his ranch was. He said, I could get in my truck at dawn, and in the evening, I still haven't made it to the edge of my spread. And the Oklahoma dirt farmer says, yeah, I got a truck just like that. They weren't using trucks to come across the immigrant trails back in the 1840s and 50s, but they were following roads that were laid out by trappers who were essentially following roads laid out by Native Americans, who in essence were following trails that were laid out by the critters that they were chasing to bring in for food. So we're going to use the section of the trail that goes from the Kansas River up to the Platte River as a sort of an experimental route to show you how the fur trade influenced immigrant trails. If we can, there it is. Now, essentially the fur trade, how did I do that? It's just slow. That's what it is. I'm not patient enough. Essentially, the fur trade from the Rocky Mountain area is coming from the St. Louis area going to the west. And we got all these Hudson Bay guys coming up here, coming to Rendezvous, coming from the west to the east. And so these fur traders are laying out these trails that are going to get followed by the immigrants. They showed eventually that even wheeled traffic could follow that. But what we're not talking about is Sublette's Cutoff. If you know about immigrant trails, you've probably heard about Sublette's Cutoff. That's on the west side of the Continental Divide. Sublette's Trace is on the east side of the Continental Divide. This is coming down off of South Pass, and Sublette's Cutoff cuts right across over here. Pinedale's right up here. So it's not too far from where we are right now. But that's not what we're talking about today. We're not talking about Sublette's Cutoff. We're talking about Sublette's Trace. And there's more about this in the article. So what the trace essentially goes, we'll talk about the development of it, but just so you get an idea, this is Westport in the The jumping off place eventually moves west from St. Louis into the Westport area. And it follows the Santa Fe Trail for about 40 miles. Then it cuts up to the Kansas River. And then it crosses the Kansas River right about where the Kansas Indian Agency was, comes over, in the early years, came all the way to the Blue, but they started shortcutting it and going up the Vermilion, up to the Blue, to the Little Blue, and from there, they just take that Little Blue and cut right off up to Grand Island, which is in Nebraska. So they're going from the Kansas River to the Platte River, which is just inside of Nebraska. And that starts, come on, baby. There it goes. That starts through the traditional territories of three main tribal peoples, the Pawnee, the Otos, and the Kanza or Kanza, or sometimes you'll see them called the Kaw. So here's the Kansas River, here's the Platte River, and those are the primary tribes. And throughout trapper journals, you see a lot of interactions with Pawnee. That's probably the one you see the most in this area, but also interactions with Kanza and Oto tribal peoples as well. And these guys already had trails developed. The Pawnee had a trail that went straight on down almost to Santa Fe. The Kaw had trails all through here too. And those are the trails that these trappers are finding, and they're already laid out. So they are obviously the most efficient routes to get from one place to the other. The Pawnee and the Kansas lived in relatively permanent dwellings. There were big earth lodges, and they would make these trails that they were following because they were either going after the buffalo and following those migratory patterns of the buffalo, or headed into sacred sites, or going from village to village. Prior to the kickoff of the 1800s, we had a lot of French people, French explorers. All these guys are working their way into that Kansas Platte River area, exploring. And Etienne de Vinard sur de Bourgemont, I think I said that pretty close, French guy. He was the first guy to actually name the Platte River the Nebraskière, and that meant flat water. And his French buddies all called it the Rivière Platte, and so it became known as the Platte River. And it had a pretty important role in early fur trade overland travel. Robert Stewart, as early as 1812, as he's coming eastward from Astoria, he hits the Platte, follows the Platte straight over to the Missouri. And we see a lot of expeditions shortly after that. Stephen Harriman Long, he goes west on the Platte, following the Platte up to the Rocky Mountains. A lot of those early expeditions, Ashley goes up the Platte. So we see the Platte being used real heavily. And the Platte was a distinguishing part. It sort of separated the upper Missouri from the lower Missouri. It was a key place, almost like sailors who crossed the equator. Once you went past the Platte, if you were a greenhorn, you got thrown in the river. You might have got your head shaved. You might have got an ear cuff pinched on. You might have had to buy a round of drinks for everybody on the boat. But it was a major landmark for guys who were headed up the Missouri River. Come on, baby. Don't lay me down. There we go. But once we get into what we look at as the fur trade now, we see on the way back from Lewis and Clark expedition, they run into John McClellan, Zebulon Pike. They didn't meet him, but he had been out there as well. They'd both been out to the mouth of the Platte. Here's Robert Stewart, like to talk about it. He's heading eastward, but he's going along that Platte River route. Stephen Harriman Long, Platte River route. David Meriwether is an interesting fellow. He had been involved with the Pawnee trade. He met Toussaint Charbonneau, the guy from Lewis and Clark. And Charbonneau says, you need to get some trade goods and get out there to them Pawnees because they got a lot of good stuff for you. So David Meriwether, he ends up going with a Pawnee party all down as far as the Canadian River southward. And they get attacked by the Mexican army, and 3 of the Pawnees are wounded. So David Meriwether runs on with the Mexicans, and he ends up in Santa Fe. He throws in jail for a couple of weeks, but he's finally let go and told never to come back. And about 20 years later, he becomes the governor of Santa Fe. So interesting little twist there. In 1824, James Clyman is headed east, and he ends up going down the Platte straight over to Fort Atkinson. And a few weeks behind him, here comes Thomas Fitzpatrick and a couple of guys. They're coming down the Platte. And in 24, 25, Ashley's using the Platte as well. Ashley leaves Fort Atkinson in 24 and talks about having a wagon with him. But that's about all we know, is that he left Fort Atkinson with a wagon. Kind of an intriguing tease there about wheeled travel on the Oregon, what would become the Oregon Trail. He runs into snow pretty early on, and most historians surmise that that wagon probably got bogged down in the snow. If I'm going kind of fast, it's because I got about 20 minutes to cover an hour and a half. So we're not going to get done. Don't worry about that. Just read the article and you find all you need to know. If you don't have a copy of the article, they're for sale in the Rocky Mountain Fur Trade Journal, volume 15 in the Museum Trading Post. End of commercial. Now, everything shifts in 1823 following the Arikara battle. A lot of the guys that were going into the Rocky Mountains were going up to Missouri. After that Arikara War, the Missouri is pretty well closed off, so they got to find overland routes. So in that 1823, they all kind of drift back downstream after the battle, and pretty soon they've traded for horses, and now they're going overland, heading back into the Rocky Mountains. So that changed the complexion of all that was going on. Now, William Ashley partners up with Jedediah Smith. Andrew Henry retires, Jedediah Smith becomes a partner, and in the late fall of 1825, some accounts say October 31st, some say November 1st. You know, what difference does the day make? It's still awfully late in the season to be leaving Santa Fe. But they talk about getting over to this fort over here on the Kansas, mouth of the Kansas, and picking up some food there. They go on up to Kansas. They talk about being at the Kaw Village. Then they go up the Republican. Now, the Republican is the next river downstream from the Blue. Remember the Sublette Trace went up the Blue originally. The next river downstream is the Republican. They run into some snow, and they end up staying the winter here at this Pawnee Village. There's another Pawnee Village right back in here, but the one they winter at is the one over here that's just over the Nebraska border. This arrow here points this. By the way, let me talk about this map for a second. This is a John C. Fremont map that was done in the early 1840s, but a guy named George Gibbs finds this map. He has a copy of a map that was made by Jedediah Smith, so he starts penciling in. So this says Pawnee Village, it says 1826 right there. Those are the things that George Gibbs has written in based on what he learned from Smith's map. So we know that Smith goes up this way. He eventually gets up to the Pawnee Village near the Grand Island, and it takes the winter. They're just socked in with snow. The mules are dying, so they got to send some guys. They send Jim Beckworth and Moses Black Harris, back to St. Louis to get Ashley to come rescue them with some more horses, and they all get hooked up back at Grand Island in the spring of 26 and head on west. Now, one of the things that Fremont put on this map was this line here that he called the Pawnee Trail. And he's pretty close, but what happened with Fremont was he crosses the Pawnee Trail about 3 times in all of his explorations. And so he just presumes that they must all connect the dots, and he makes this line, but the Pawnee Trail actually comes down over this way. So that's an error on Fremont's map, but the Pawnee Trail comes down over here. So this is a pretty cool map. If you can find it online in a pretty high resolution, and you can see all the places that George Gibbs has written in information from Jedediah Smith's travels. Now, there was that expedition that went to rescue Jedediah Smith. Whoever was leading that expedition kept a journal. We believe it was William Ashley, and this is a page from that journal, and it doesn't show up too terribly well with the lighting that we have, but the Kansas River, this is the Kansas River, and he's showing a couple of, like, this is the sauterelle, which is French for grasshopper. It's called the grasshopper for a lot of places in immigrant trail journals today. It's called the Delaware, and way up here is the Vermilion River. So we know that they go up to Kansas, at least as far as the Vermilion. This is one of the first, it's not quite the Sublette Trace yet, but it's pretty darn close. And it's one of the first Oregon Trail maps that we have in existence. In 1827 now, we've got Ashley and Smith out in the mountains, out to the Rendezvous in the summer of 26. In January of 27, the Smith, Sublette, and Smith, Jackson, and Sublette Company has to get word back to William Ashley that they want to order for goods. So on January 1st, Sublette and Harris leave the Salt Lake Valley so they can get back to St. Louis by March 1st. They have a horrible trip. They've got one little pack dog with them. They're traveling by snowshoes. The pack dog is not able to keep up because his paws are getting caught up on the snow and ice, cut up on the snow and ice. They end up eating the dog. They have to kill a raven at one point for food. It's just a really, really rough trip. But they find this Kansas Trail, and that Kansas Trail takes them from Grand Island down the Blue River to the Big Vermilion. And that's where Sublette's Trace initially gets let out. This 1827 winter trip is what historians say is the establishment of Sublette's Trace. The crazy thing about it is that he gets into St. Louis on March 4th. He's 3 days late, but actually still honors the deal. He gets the supplies, turns right around, and goes back up Sublette's Trace to the Rendezvous. Okay, and that's in the spring of 27. Now in the fall, or in the late summer of 27, he brings the furs again back to St. Louis along Sublette's Trace, gets supplies, and turns right around in that fall of 27 and goes back up Sublette's Trace. So in the course of 12 months, or even less than that, he's traveled that trace 4 times, twice going east and twice going west. Whew. I don't know how he does it. And so that kind of leads into why it's called Sublette Trace. But of course, in the next couple of years, he's on it again, makes his 5th trip on the trace in the fall of 28. And then again, he goes out and he ends up traveling that Sublette Trace about 10 times in about 2.5 years. This guy really knows this trail. In 1830, he makes the decision to try to take supplies to the Rendezvous by wagon train. This is the first time that wheeled vehicles have gone up Sublette's Trace. He makes it all the way to the Rendezvous, which was on the east side of the Continental Divide, so he did not cross South Pass. This is a painting that was done by William Henry Jackson in 1930 to celebrate the 100th anniversary of wagons going out to the Rocky Mountains. It must have been a little bit hesitant on Sublette's part. There must have been a little bit of feeling of risk because this was the first time anybody had ever taken wagons out there. But he'd been across that trail enough times to know the ins and the outs. But they were still having to dig down riverbanks to be able to get a slope well enough that a wagon could get down, using ropes to pull the wagons back up out of the riverbeds, cutting down trees, all that kind of thing. It must have been a pretty hard trip, but he successfully gets them out there. He's got 3 of these Dearborn wagons. They're called Dearborns. Those end up getting left, and nobody ever really talks about what happened to those, but they could be somewhere around Riverton for all I know. In 1832, Benjamin Bonneville takes wagons across the Continental Divide. This is the first time that wagons actually go over South Pass. He comes down, he's got 20 wagons, and he brings them down into Green River Valley, and about, I don't know, 8 or 9 miles from here, he is where he ends up and builds his picketed fort and then immediately goes to the Salmon to winter. Now, and also in 1832, the same year that Bonneville takes wagons, Nathaniel Wyeth is bringing a bunch of guys out. He gets to St. Louis with these crazy half boat, half wagon contraptions that he's put together. And of course, they tell him that ain't going to hack it. So he sells those, not Wyethiums, they called them. They're kind of an aquatic wagon. And he hooks up with William Sublette. They follow up the trace and they pass Bonneville. They talk about seeing Bonneville along the way. John Ball was the fellow who traveled with Nathaniel Wyeth, and he kept an itinerary that showed more than just, this is just a section of that itinerary that shows all the different rivers, and you can see the Kansas, you can see where he gets to the Platte. So they're going up that Sublette Trace just as pretty as you please. Robert Campbell in 33 does the same thing. He's got Charles Larpenteur with him, who's keeping a journal, and Larpenteur talks about crossing the Call, the river of the first river of any consequence. I love how he spells. He says we crossed the Big, we crossed the Little Blue, so they're on Sublette's Trace, and they finally get up to the Platte. In 34, we got a lot of guys going out that are keeping journals. William Marshall Anderson is traveling with William Sublette. couple of guys that are with Wyeth, Jason Lee and Cyrus Shepard, they're both keeping journals. John Townsend is with Wyeth, he's keeping journals, and they're all going up Sublette's Trace. So 1834 is the year that we have the best accounts of all of those guys that are on that trace. William Marshall Anderson says that on May 11th, we crossed a creek on Sublette's Trace. This is the first place that the name of Sublette Trace shows up in any journals. And there were two other supply trains that went west in 34, one from the American Fur Company and one that was going out to supply Bonneville. William Marshall Anderson talks about them all arriving at Council Grove at the same time, or Sapling Grove, but we don't really hear anything after about which direction they took, but they all end up at the rendezvous at Hams Fork. So we surmise that they probably took Sublette's Trace as well. 1837, Thomas Fitzpatrick is leading the supply train. This is when William Drummond Stewart is bringing out Alfred Jacob Miller. Miller paints a number of paintings of scenes along the way. This is the crossing of the Kansas. There's no journal that exists from that trip, but based particularly on the paintings and the notes that Alfred Jacob Miller keeps, it's pretty clear that they went up to Sublette's Trace as well. I am vastly running out of time here. 37, a missionary named William Gray is going to leave the rendezvous and come back to St. Louis to recruit more people. And he sits down with Moses Black Harris, and he makes this list of all the rivers that he's going to pass. So this is leaving Westport. The Big Blue that flows into the Missouri is this first one. He called it the Kansas, but it's actually the one that flows into the Missouri. Then as he's going up the Kansas, he's going to cross the Wakarusa and just ride on down until he gets to the Big Platte. So there, he's obviously headed up Sublette's Trace as well. 1840, Frederick Wieslizinus, he's with the 1839 caravan. He talks about leaving the Santa Fe Trail and taking a narrow wagon road established by former journeys to the Rocky Mountains. This is an image of crossing the Grand Vermilion that was sketched in 1841, but you can see how steep these banks are, and they've had to cut down the bed lines to get an incline that's not so steep that they lose control. And then here it is in the 1840s, Joel Walker, the brother of Joe Walker, Joel Walker and his wife and their 4 kids bring a wagon. They're the first immigrants. Here's where Sublette Trace flips into an immigrant trail. These are the first people to travel to Oregon, and they get to the green and they rendezvous there with the trappers. I love that. So here's a list of the parties. This is in the article. You can see just kind of a timeline and of all the different groups that are headed up Sublette's Trace. In 1843, we have the first tourists coming back. William Drummond Stewart, who loved the Rocky Mountains, he put together a last hurrah in 1843, led by William Sublette. They bring about 80 to 90 guys all the way out to Fremont Lake, and they follow up the Sublette Trace. Field's diary talks about a number of different places that they see along the way, crossing the Blue, that sort of thing. We made an early start and struck a broad drift running stream called the Vermilion, though some of the older travelers mistook it for the Blue. So it's only a difference of a shade of opinion. I thought that was pretty funny. You see what they did there? That Matt Field, he's pretty clever. There's today a monument at the crossing of the Independence Road, which is what eventually from the Kansas up to this conjunction with the St. Joe Road was called. And then from there, it was called the St. Joe Independence Road. But this marker is there, and it commemorates the Oregon Trail from 1827, which was that winter trek of Sublette and Harris, all the way to 1875 being used by immigrants. Thank you very much.
We're running tight for time, so I would like you to save questions you have for Jim, for him personally after the talk. Remember what he looks like, remember that face, and feel free to ask him questions. Our next speaker is Michael Schaubs, who I first met at Bent's Fort. He's a longtime volunteer at Bent's Fort, where he portrays a what would you say, a trader. And he was the one who signed me in to work for the Bent brothers when I was there for a living history event. He has, through his experience at Bensport, become very knowledgeable about the goods of the fur trade. And through his study of what trade goods were available and what the sales patterns were, he's been able to make suppositions about the life at a trading post. And he's done a careful analysis of the records we have of Fort Hall. And I won't take any more of his time, and I'll turn it right over to Michael.
Hello? Yes. Thank you, Scott. As Scott mentioned, I'm very interested in the material culture of the fur trade, and as part of that, I'm very interested in inventories and ledgers and account books. And also, professionally, I was a scientist all of my career, so data analysis comes natural to me. So I look at an account book or an inventory not as simply a list, but as a data source that's waiting to be diced, sliced, baked, and to see what comes out of it. Now, before I get going in this talk, I'd like to mention that there is an error in the paper on page 121. I state that Robert Evans was earning a salary of $300 a year and getting his purchases of merchandise at cost plus 50%. He did not get cost plus 50%. He only got $300. It was Captain Joseph Thing who was getting his merchandise at cost plus 50%. So that's an error, but it doesn't change much in the course of the paper. It's just for your information. So, whoop. Well, while we're getting it back on, a few words about the origin of Fort Hall. In 1833, when Nathaniel Wyeth was in the mountains, he met up with members of the Rocky Mountain Fur Company. The Rocky Mountain Fur Company was deeply in debt to William Sublette at this time, and Sublette had a hammerlock on the Rocky Mountain Fur Company because of this debt. Nathaniel Wyeth proposed that he would be an alternate supplier of goods to the Rocky Mountain Fur Company, providing them at a lower cost, allowing them to get out of debt to Sublette, William Sublette. So this was a secret agreement. Theoretically, it was a secret agreement. Nathaniel Wyeth went back to New York, purchased goods. Somehow, Sublette found out about it. And it's not surprising because it was a very close society. William Sublette was brothers with Milton Sublette. Milton Sublette was one of the partners in the Rocky Mountain Fur Companies. And so somehow William Sublette found out about this and raced Nathaniel Wyeth's company up to the mountains in the spring of 1834, beat Nathaniel Wyeth, called in the debts of the company, and essentially dissolved the company. When Nathaniel Wyeth got up there, the company refused to accept his merchandise and defaulted on the contract. Thank you. The business plan of the Columbia River Fishing and Trading Company, which was Nathaniel Wyeth's company, was essentially very similar to that attempted by William Ashley about 20 years earlier. Wyeth was going to supply trade goods to the mountains by sailing ship up the Columbia River as far as navigation went, through a post he was going to establish on the east side or the west side of the Continental Divide to supply his own trappers or trappers of another company. And another company was going to be the Rocky Mountain Fur Company. Well, when the Rocky Mountain Fur Company defaulted, the plan went kind of haywire. One thing that was unique about Nathaniel Wyeth's business plan was he planned on harvesting salmon from the Columbia River, packing them in barrels and sending them back east. The plan was that the salmon would pay the cost of shipping and the furs would then be profit free and clear. So this was a unique aspect of his plan. Well, when the Rocky Mountain Fur Company defaulted on his contract, he was left with about $3,000 worth of trade goods that he didn't anticipate having when he went across the mountains. He anticipated having the amount of approximately $3,000 worth of packs of beaver fur. He did plan on having a fort over there. It was not a surprise that he was going to construct a fort. Joe Meek reported that Nathaniel Wise said when the Rocky Mountain Fur Company defaulted, "Gentlemen, I will roll a stone into your garden. You will never get out." Now, this was a stone Nathaniel Wise always intended to roll. But like I said, he planned on having furs, not immediately all the goods. One thing, in a letter he wrote in, I've lost it. He wrote a letter to his investors in back east. He said, "I propose to fill this contract. If they should not do so, then I will proceed to a safe country on the Columbia River where some furs may be traded and leave them with a few men, leaving some men and a trusty person to keep them in trade, as many more as he can." So he is already anticipating the possibility that the Rocky Mountain Fur Company is going to default. And also in the spring of that year, or January, he writes to a supplier in Missouri saying, "You can also be looking up 2 bulls and 8 cows for driving overland to stock a fort." So he's anticipating having this fort already. It's not something that came out of the blue when the Rocky Mountain Fur Company defaulted on his contract. This is a timeline of significant events at Fort Hall. The locations of the fall hunt, spring hunt, and the following fall hunt, these are approximate values. Spring hunt and fall hunt were variable from year to year, depending on weather conditions, depending on geography, depending on who was in the area and how desperate they were to hunt. But this is approximate locations of those. The important things on this diagram are the initiation of construction of Fort Hall. And in December 1834, Captain Thing arrives with goods and 10 men. They're coming up from the Columbia River. The goods are goods that are brought in by the Maid Dacker, a sailing ship that came around. And then again that was December 24th, 1834. And then on November 15th, 1835, Captain Thing again arrives at Fort Hall with goods brought up from the Columbia River. And the reasons these are important points is that I'm going to be discussing these later on in the paper. Now, deconstructing the account book. I'm going to use statistics to look at a lot of trends and stuff in here. And a phrase made famous by supposedly given to Disraeli. Mark Twain made this phrase famous, but he's supposedly quoting Disraeli. "Lies, damned lies, and statistics." So I leave it up to you to decide what category we're talking about here. The Fort Hall account book, like I say, this is a tremendous data set for me. It runs from August 4th, 1834 through December 35th, 1835, a total of 17 months. There are approximately 7,400 line items of information in this account book. Total retail value of sales comes to $19,400. 140 men are listed in the account book. Not all of those men are employees of the company. There are a number of men listed that we know belong to opposition outfits, opposition trappers. These men who are listed in the books do not get to run an account. What they have to do is they have to pay at the time they make their purchases. Kit Carson is one of these who makes purchases, and the way he pays for his purchases, he trades traps. He's trading beaver traps for his purchases. Annual wages for 43 men that we can calculate annual wages for range from $122 to $600 a year. The low end of the wage scale, $122, belongs to men who are described as Kanakas, Hawaiians, and a man described only as Negro. The man who's making $600 a year, he is the company hunter, David Crow. Robert Evans was making $300 a year. Robert Evans was succeeded by Abel Baker Jr., who was also making $300 a year. These men were successively in charge of Fort Hall. The fact that they're making such a relatively low annual wage suggests to me that they were promised a share of profits, but I have no documentation for that. The average wage of the men that we have wage information for was $213.37 a year. This comes to an average daily wage of 58 cents. Now, you can compare this to the average or the cost of a pint of liquor. A pint of alcohol costs $3. So at 58 cents, that's about 6 days' wages to purchase a pint of liquor. One of the things I did with this to make it easier to analyze is I broke the sales of different types of merchandise down into what I called functional categories. I used the functional categories of Dean Anderson. Dean Anderson wrote a paper on material culture of trade goods in the Great Lakes region in 1991. Most of these categories are categories that Dean Anderson came up with. I've added 2 to his list of them. Transportation, he did not have transportation listed, and he did not have miscellaneous. Miscellaneous is stuff that just doesn't fit into any other categories. A silver pencil, an empty mustard bottle. These are things that just don't fit into other categories. You'll notice that the total sales is $18,700. I said earlier that total sales were $19,400. The difference being on some of those lines of data, multiple goods are listed. Gunpowder, kettles, axes. No totals are given, just a total dollar value. So I couldn't break those lines down into individual categories. So I couldn't put them into this chart. Another interesting thing about this chart is the order in which the functional categories come. Our number 1 category is clothing, fabrics, and sewing. 38% of sales are clothing, fabrics, and sewing. Then cooking and foods, hunting, adornment, and finally alcohol sales. Alcohol is highly profitable, but it's in 5th place. Other things are showing a higher priority in terms of spending at Fort Hall than alcohol. Another thing that I've done here is I had a cutoff of right there. Anything with 1% or more of sales, I call a major functional category. Anything less than 1% of sales, I've called a minor functional category. The major functional categories are easier to analyze because there's a lot of data for those. The minor functional categories, for instance, like weapons or fishing, we're looking at just over $20 worth of sales. The sales of a single item in a different month or 2 of those items can significantly change the appearance of those categories because there's such small numbers of sales in those. One of the statistical tools I used was correlation coefficients. A correlation coefficient is simply a statistical way of looking at a pair of variables. This is time independent, it has nothing to do with time. The closer a pair of variables comes to a straight line is a high degree of correlation. In this case, because it's a straight line, that is a correlation as a coefficient of 1. Correlation coefficients range from 1 to -1. This is a positive one because the line goes up to the right. A negative would be a line that goes down to the right. So that's a 1. This is a 0.5 correlation coefficient, or I'm sorry, 0.85. This is a 0.5, and this is a 0.15. So you can see as the correlation coefficient goes down, it gets to be more and more like a shotgun scatter shot. The important thing to realize about this is, although a pair of variables may correlate very, very closely, it doesn't necessarily mean there's a cause and effect there. It doesn't mean that. And as an example of this, when I was taking statistics a long time ago, One of the examples of this was in New York City, ice cream sales and murders. There's a high degree of correlation between ice cream sales and murders. Does this mean that people who eat a lot of ice cream are likely to go bonkers and murder their neighbors? It doesn't mean that at all. What happens is there's another variable that was not accounted for, temperature. As temperatures go up, more people eat ice cream. As temperatures go up, people get uncomfortable, they get irritable, tend to murder their neighbors. So there's no relationship there, but there is a strong correlation. So this is where the lies, damn lies, and statistics come in. We're going to look at correlation coefficients, but it doesn't necessarily mean that there's a cause and effect to that. However, where there's no correlation, it probably means there is no cause and effect there. Of the correlations, now these are correlations based on percent of sales during a given month, not total dollar value of sales. And I'll get into that in just a little bit. I have significant, or first of all, to come up with these, I did what was called a correlation coefficient matrix. I compared 100 variable data pairs to come up with these 7 categories that had significant correlations. I have 3 positive and I have 4 negative. Of the positive ones are a little easier to explain. Number of men in transportation. Transportation is dominated by the sale of horses and mules. Horses and mules are very expensive. They range from $70 up to way over $100. So a single sale of a horse or mule really drives the category. And when there's large numbers of men around, there's likely to be more sales of horses and mules. So that explains that category. Amusements and alcohol. The amusement category is playing cards. It's only playing cards. Drinking and relaxation and card playing, gambling and alcohol seem to go together in many cultures and many places. So this is a natural correlation here. Woodworking and cooking is a little harder to make a correlation to or explain the correlation. But when we look at the items in woodworking, 65% of sales in woodworking are items described as squaw axes. Small, lightweight axes, not much good for cutting down trees, but very good for cutting firewood for cooking purposes. So that would explain the relationship between cooking and woodworking. Of the significant negative correlations, it's not so easy to explain. Woodworking and alcohol, grooming and alcohol, the number of men in clothing, I can't come up with any explanation for that. Hunting and clothing, maybe I can. Hunting, traps, guns, gunpowder, gun flints, so on. These are things that are absolutely necessary for these men to conduct their business, their occupation. Clothing, being the largest functional category, is the easiest area to cut back when the men needed to increase their spending of necessary items for their occupation. So that's how I think that negative correlation came about. This represents simply retail sales by month. As the time goes by, I plotted the total sales, total resale sales by month. And you can see there's a very high spike in the winter off season, 1834, 1835, another spike in the summer off season, 1835, and another spike going into the winter off season, 1835, 1836. For the most part, I leave the first 3 months out of my analyses. And the reason for that, there's 3 reasons for that. The first reason is the men who've come up from Missouri have only been on the trail for a couple of months at this point. Their clothing, their equipment, their gear is all in relatively good shape, not needing replacement at this point. Another thing is that on completion of Fort Hall, Nathaniel Wyeth leaves only 12 men at the fort. Everybody else he sends out trapping or takes with him down the Columbia River to establish his facilities down the Columbia River. So there's almost nobody at the fort. And the final reason I'm leaving this out is, at this point, the men have not got much in the way of earned wages. Now, they're not paid wages until the end of the year, but they have not got much, let's say, credit. And Wyeth is really concerned about credit of his employees. And let me find what he says here on that. He says in his instructions to Robert Evans, he says, "You will give no supplies to any of your men unless the company are $20 in their debt by the accounts which are handed you." And he's really concerned about this because on his way up to Rendezvous, he is extending credit to his men, and sometimes they owe him a considerable amount of money, and he is worried about them defecting. They're more likely to defect if they owe him money. They are not likely to defect if he owes them money. So he's trying to get things back on track by saying this. Another thing to notice on this chart is the spike starts really in November of the first winter off season, whereas in the second winter off season, the spike starts in October, much earlier. It's spiking much earlier than in the earlier period. Osborne Russell provides us with the answer to why this spike is happening, or the earlier time frame for this spike. In October 19th, 1835, Russell writes, "The time for which myself and all of Mr. Wyeth's men were engaged had recently expired." And in a statement a little later, he writes, "In the meantime, the men about the fort were doing nothing until Mr. Wyeth should return and give us our discharge." So instead of being out trapping during this later part of the fall hunt, the men are arriving, they're congregating at Fort Hall, they're waiting for Wyeth to arrive and give them their discharge. And as a result, while they're hanging around the fort, they're spending their accumulated wages. Now, one thing we can notice about this is this point in the winter of 35-36 is equivalent to this point in 34-35. So much, much higher at that point. Does this mean that going into January, February, that sales are going to go up to here? I don't think so. I think sales from January and February are being pulled forward because those men who would have been out trapping are now spending their wages earlier in the season. I've broken things down a little further on that chart. This chart shows number of men who are listed on the ledgers as being present at the fort in any given month, and the average sales per man during that given month. You can see everything again peaks in the winter of 1835-36, 73 men, average sales per man, $56.21. It goes down to a nadir of 23 men and a low of $8.65 in the spring, during the spring hunt. Comes up to $62 and $28, back down and then back up. Of interest is 73 men goes down to 62 men between the winter off season and the summer off season. This is a decrease of 15%. However, sales per man goes down almost 50%. Tells me that something different is going on. There is a different reason the men are at the fort during the winter off season than they are at the fort during the summer off season. The lower value of sales indicates to me that they are back there for perhaps business reasons, perhaps to drop off packs of furs that they accumulated during the spring hunt, that they are spending much less time at the fort than they did during the winter off season. And that makes sense too, because during the winter off season, snow conditions are going to really restrict transportation. The men are likely to be hunkered down around the fort waiting for the spring thaw. I think that's all I'll say on that one. This is sales by major functional categories. These are total dollar value of sales. And one thing I might say about this is when I was doing my graduate work, my thesis advisor was famous for trying to put all the data in the world on a single diagram. And it looks like I learned from him about putting all the data in the world on a single diagram. These are the major functional categories, and we're not going to look at any individual category. The thing I want to get across here is basically everything is spiking at the same time. Everything is down in its nadir at the same time. If I did correlation coefficients on raw data, I'm going to come up with everything correlating with everything else. And that doesn't help me trying to determine relationships between the different data sets. Looking at the minor functional categories, we have a lot more noise in these categories. And the reason for that is because they're very, very much smaller numbers of sales where individual sales are distorting the patterns exhibited by these categories. This is a chart that shows the difference between comparisons of dollar value versus comparisons of percent value. And what a percent value comparison is, it's looking at total sales in a given month and the percent of that functional category during that given month. Basically, what I'm looking at there is the importance that the customers are placing on different categories in a given month. That is, their spending priorities. How did they prioritize the money they had to spend in any given month? So here we have hunting and clothing. Remember, I had a negative correlation on those. Using dollar value only, it looks like there's a very strong positive correlation. When I look at percent values, there's a negative correlation where clothing falls, hunting comes up. Where clothing goes up, hunting goes down, and so on. So this is where I get that negative correlation for hunting and clothing. We're going to look at the cooking and foods category here. The blue line is the category total. This is the total percent sales during any given month. The gold line is sales of foodstuff. This is eatables, flour, rice, sugar, so on. The gray line is cooking equipment, kettles, pots, pans, tin cups. With cooking and foods, it's a very erratic data, but if we draw a best fit trend line through there, we see that it's going up with time. The way I explain this is with time, being a trapper is a very difficult, very hard, very demanding profession. With time, their equipment is getting abused. It's starting to need to be replaced. The longer time goes on, the more equipment that needs to be replaced. And so the sales of this type of equipment increase with time. What's interesting about this diagram is food sales essentially dominates the category. The category total equals foodstuffs plus cooking equipment. It always equals foodstuffs plus cooking equipment. So you can see foodstuffs dominates through April, and then all of a sudden in May, it drops off drastically. This tells me that something is going on. What is going on? Suddenly, did the trappers' dietary desires change? Did they stop buying food? Were they no longer interested in flour and sugar? What's going on? So I took a closer look at this and charted sales of the different food items at Fort Hall through time. These are the items that appear on the ledgers that Fort Hall is selling. These are the totals that's sold. And oops, we're missing this down here. Sugar is the dominant item sold. There's like nearly $1,000 worth of sugar sold. Then comes coffee, and then comes flour. These three items dominate sales of food. And starting in June, we see that, where am I here? Okay, at the end of June, sales of flour disappear. Starting in June, sales of sugar disappear, and coffee, of course, continues all the way through. So why all of a sudden, after largely continuous sales of flour. Did it stop for a while and then pick up in November? Sugar, which is a huge selling item, stopped in July. We have a very minor odd sale in October, and then pick up strongly in November. What's going on? What's happening here? I think what this is showing is that at Fort Hall, they ran out of flour, they ran out of sugar during June. Sales of these items stopped. In November 15th of 1835, Captain Fink comes up from the Columbia River with supplies, and all of a sudden they have flour and they have sugar again. Also, we have an odd sale of essence of peppermint showing up in November. Now, I have to clarify, there's a little bit of an oddity. Captain Fink shows up in November 15th. Sales of sugar start hugely November 2nd. Sales of flour start hugely November 2nd. So this is 12 days before Captain Fink arrives at the fort. So if I'm calling on them to run out of these items, why do they suddenly start selling them before Captain Fink shows up? It could be because some of this stuff was cached by Wyeth before he left Fort Hall. There were cached supplies at Fort Hall, and they included 420 pounds of sugar. They included 120 pounds of flour. So perhaps some of this stuff was coming out of cache. Abel Baker Jr. is in charge of the fort at this time, and as these men are starting to congregate at the fort, waiting their discharge from Nathaniel Wyeth, perhaps he realizes that he's missing out on a lot of sales if he can only get the stuff out of cache and start selling it. Problem with that idea is he had 420 pounds of sugar. He only had 120 pounds of flour. The records show that in addition to the sales that were being made, there were disbursements. Disbursements was the shorthand for gifts to the Indians. There were disbursements of 240 pounds of flour. So he's giving out more flour than was recorded as being in the cache. So the other explanation for this possibly is that realizing he was short of these items, he sent an express down to Captain Fink, who's coming up, and says, look, we need this stuff and we need it in a hurry. Please send this stuff on ahead before you get here. So Joseph Fink may have sent that stuff up ahead. That's the only explanation I can come to that. A few other things about this. Chocolate, no sales of chocolate until January 1835. No sales of mustard until January 35. Pepper starts in December. Rice starts in December. And pepper and rice start 2 days after Joseph Fink comes up from the Columbia River with supplies. And the sales of chocolate start up very shortly thereafter in January. Chocolate runs out in 3 months and they don't ever have chocolate again. Pepper, they have good supplies of that. Rice runs out very quickly and doesn't show up again until after Captain Fink's November visit. Rice, or tea runs out in February and doesn't show up again until after Joseph Fink comes up in November again. So what this is telling me is that Nathaniel Wyeth had some supply issues. With better management of supplies, he could have had much larger sales, but he never had a chance to refine his purchases from experience because the venture really didn't go anyplace. Alcohol is another interesting thing. To start off, we're going to look at a broad view of the alcohol sales. Average sales, now I'm looking at entire sales of alcohol in a given month and dividing it by the number of men present in the month. Average sales never exceed $4.30 in any given month. And that high value was during the winter of 1834, 1835. The low value was during the summer off season, came to $2.56. $4.30 per man comes to about 1.5 pints per month. This is not per day, this is per month, 1.5 pints per month, coming up on a per day basis, this is like an ounce of alcohol per day. It's hard to get drunk, roaring drunk on an ounce of alcohol per day. In July of 1837, this is the month when Rendezvous is taking place, where that orgy of celebration is taking place at Rendezvous. There are 0 sales of alcohol at Fort Hall, and there are 37 men who are present at alcohol during that month. So they are obviously not prioritizing celebrations or family reunions or anything like that. They are business oriented during that summer period. This supports that earlier contention I made, and also suggests that there's a generally sober condition that exists at Fort Hall. Another thing we can look at is holiday consumption. The big holidays are Christmas, New Year's. July 4th is a huge holiday. During Christmas 1834, 21 pints are sold. New Year's Eve, New Year's Day, a half pint. Hard to get drunk on a half pint of alcohol. July 4th, another big holiday, that's during that summer period, 0 alcohol sales. And Christmas 1835, 15 pints are given, 4 pints are purchased. It doesn't indicate that there's huge celebrations going on during these holidays. Another thing I looked at is a more granular look at alcohol sales. This is what's called the frequency diagram. On the vertical axis, I've got the number of purchases. On the horizontal axis is the size of those purchases. 80% of sales are 1 pint or less. 80% of sales are 1 pint or less. 40% of sales are 1/2 pint or less. These men are obviously not buying large quantities of alcohol to get drunk. There are 11 sales above 8 pints. 8 pints is 1 gallon. 11 sales above 1 gallon. 8 of those purchases above 1 gallon are Thomas McKay. Thomas McKay is he was an employee of the Hudson's Bay Company before and after this season. Ostensibly, he is an independent during this period of time, but I think he mostly likely was kind of a spy on Nathaniel Wyeth, keeping track of what was going on in Nathaniel Wyeth's operations. I think Nathaniel Wyeth knew this. Nathaniel Wyeth was trying to establish business relationships with the Hudson's Bay Company at this time. So Nathaniel Wyeth tolerated it. He encouraged it. So 8 of those sales are to Thomas McKay. Thomas McKay is using these to provide alcohol to his trappers, not to men at the fort. There is a single sale of 26 pints to Joseph Thing. 26 pints is 3 1/4 gallons. Joseph Thing is not a big drinker. Other than that purchase, he has, during the 17 months of record, he has only 1 other purchase of alcohol for 1 pint. He is not a big drinker. Again, it's clear that he is probably providing alcohol for the men to celebrate with. This sale is on December 4th, 1835. He has just arrived at Fort Hall a couple of weeks earlier. And Nathaniel Wyeth can certainly afford 3 1/4 gallons of alcohol. He is charged, his account is charged $2.77 for alcohol. Because of the discount Captain Thing is getting, he is getting charged much less than any other trapper or worker at Fort Hall. Anybody else buying alcohol at the going rate of $3 a pint would have been paying $78 for the alcohol he got for $2.77. So in conclusion, one more thing here. Moderation of alcohol consumption at Fort Hall is probably due to 2 things. One of them certainly is cost. Like I just said, the alcohol that Captain Thing bought would have cost anybody else $78. At an average wage of 58 cents, it takes 6 days to earn enough money to buy a pint of alcohol. So probably nobody's buying large volumes of alcohol because they can't afford it. Another thing is there's possibly a code of conduct at Fort Hall. In one of his letters, Nathaniel Wyeth writes he's really impressed with the discipline shown by William Sublette's outfit on the way up to Rendezvous. He's really impressed with the discipline, so he's probably trying to impose discipline. Drunkenness is not good for business. People get hurt, facilities get damaged, merchandise gets lost or stolen. Drunkenness is not good for business. So there's likely, I think, in my opinion, a code of conduct at Fort Hall. In conclusion, looking at the merchandise, the quantities that are sold, the dates that are sold, comparing to site history, gives us an insight into the business practices of the Columbia River Fishing and Trading Company. It gives us an insight into supply issues that are encountered at the fort. It gives us an idea of the wants and needs of the customers and how these evolved over time. And I didn't have time to get into it here, but it does show how social relationships, particularly with Indian women, developed over time. And especially with respect to alcohol, it exposes some fur trade myths to a reality check. So I thank you for your time. Oh, anybody have questions?
Yeah, we have time for questions for both Jim and Michael, and I'll pass the mic over. I saw a hand over here first.
So I actually have two questions, so I'll ask them both. Number one, you show a decline in the number of men at Fort Hall during that second July timeframe.
Mhm.
Do you have any data that shows them doing trades at Rendezvous with the traders that would have been at Rendezvous and not at Fort Hall during that time? In other words, could some of that be accounted for those men going to Rendezvous rather than trading at the fort? So that's one question. And the second question is, how much of this trade goods was available and used by the fort factors as trade items for Indians and Indian supplies?
Well, the first question, if I think I understood it correctly, I don't think a lot of Columbia River Fishing Company and trading company employees are at Rendezvous, because at Fort Hall they could run an account. If they went to Rendezvous and were trading with one of the other outfits, they were likely to have had something to trade for it. Another company is not likely to run an account for somebody else's employee. Regarding your question about the Indians, the account books show what are called disbursements, and these are recorded on the account books as at cost. Disbursement appears to be items that are given out as gifts to Indians who come in. The account books do not show any of the trades that went on between the fort and Indians.
How did you handle the runaway Kanakas? Because there was like, I can't remember for sure, but it was $2,000 or $3,000 worth of merchandise that they made off with, and that was all charged to one of the four factors or something till the Kanakas. And the other thing I'm wondering about is when you reference trappers consuming this and trappers consuming that, as Osborne Russell so delicately points out, he was a camp keeper. So I guess it wasn't necessarily trappers, it was men in the field working, because camp keepers he had $180 a year wage. He wasn't going to buy as much as the trappers that were, whether they were on shares or whatever. But the Kanakas I'm interested in, because I think that much money that they got away with and ran away with and stuff and goods and stuff could cloud your data in some categories pretty easy. So how do you treat that?
What Clay is referring to is on Captain Thing's first attempt to come up from the Columbia River Basin with trade goods. A number of Kanakas were helping him out, were part of the group, and they deserted with horses and packs full of trade goods. These were never recovered. They do not show up on the ledgers. This stuff does not show up on the ledgers. There's a few things that show up that are charged to individual Kanakas, but certainly not to the value of. I haven't seen that. I'd sure be interested to know where that is. Okay, I'm clueless as to what you've seen.
Thank you very much for attending our first two talks. We have another talk coming up at 3. Jerry Ensler has just come out with a new biography of James Bridger, and he'll be speaking at 3 and talking about the new information he's found about a very well-known member of the fur trade fraternity here in the Rockies. So that's it for us right now, unless you have any further questions. And please come back at 3 and hear what Jerry has to say.